afternoon. I want to thank everyone for being here. I'm Stephanie Stuckey Benfield with GreenLaw, and I also want to acknowledge, well, Crawford Elliott's going to say some remarks, but he and I really helped organize this program, and I'm so grateful for all of you for being here. I do want to thank, in particular, the sponsors who made this meal possible. We have Billy Hall and his lovely wife Carolyn with Newfield. And we also have the team at Georgia Solar Utilities. If y'all all want to raise your hands, I see quite a few of them over there. Thank you so much. And we have materials from Georgia Solar Utilities on our side table, and I invite you all to get the materials and also to talk to our sponsors about what they do, and we very appreciate you making this possible. I am going to call up on behalf of Georgia State University Dean Pearl McHaney, who is going to give some very brief welcoming remarks. Thank you, Pearl.
Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome. As Stephanie said, my name is Pearl McHaney. I'm Associate Dean for Fine Arts at Georgia State. The School of Music and the Welch School of Art and Design are under my purview. And I've had the honor this year of being the organizer at Georgia State in the College of Arts and Sciences of the Plummer Lecture, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. I want to first bring you greetings from Dr. Mark Becker, who's engaged at this hour with our undergraduate research conference, which is going on over on campus. And I brought the catalog. I'll put it on the sideboard if you want to take a look at it. It's very exciting, combining poster presentations, oral presentations, and even art from the School of Art and Design as part of this research conference. I also bring you greetings from Provost Risa Palm and Dean William Long, who are away on university business, coming back from Brazil, actually making connections and collaborations with Brazilian universities. And I welcome you to this event in the Bennett Brown Room on the occasion generously organized by Stephanie, who will say a few words in a moment. She gets to come back and forth since she organized and tell you many things. And I'd like to thank Dr. Crawford Elliott, who is chair of the Geosciences Department and host for Dr. Santer, and Hope Carter, who is director of development at Georgia State's College of Arts and Sciences. 14 years ago, the plumber Helen Ingram Plummer endowed a lectureship at the College of Arts and Sciences, which is rightly named the Plummer Lecture, in her honor. Helen Plummer was a strong supporter of the arts in Atlanta for decades. Vivacious and independent, encouraging, a great storyteller, laughter, making friends, instilling humanist values across generations and across the city by example, are things that have been said about Helen Plummer. And it's the Plummer Lecture that we try to reinvigorate, explore, demonstrate, teach these kinds of values. It's the generosity this year on Georgia State's 100th anniversary that we're able to welcome Dr. Ben Santer. Following a field of noted scholars of history, philosophy, art, ethics, politics, journalism, space, and theater, we're privileged to learn this month, from Dr. Santer. As I said, it's Georgia State's 100th anniversary. And at the 100 at GSU.edu website, you can learn about this history. And I'm sure that each of you will be able to find your place somewhere in that Georgia history. There's lots of photographs, momentary marks, and you can see what came before now. And then you could look at our strategic plan and see where we're going. And I invite all of you, since you've made this trek this far to downtown Atlanta, to Georgia State, to continue to explore how we might connect with you, how we might help you, how you might help our students to become better citizens. You can read a full list of our Plummer lectures also on a website at the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'll leave on the side table this flyer that we had made for Dr. Santer's lecture, so that you can see the titles of the talk that he gave yesterday and another one this afternoon at 4. And it also has the Plummer Lecture website where you can get this more information. So I welcome you to Georgia State, to the Bennett Brown Room, to this wonderful occasion that Stephanie has arranged for us. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Chuck Eaton, who is with the Public Service Commission. And I understand that he has a Georgia State connection, which I hope he's going to start with, or at least slip in there, and maybe I'll test you later on. Thank you.
Thank you. You're right. I'm a very recent law school graduate of Georgia State. I'm still having nightmares about it, so I feel like I'm still a student at Georgia State. It's going to take me a year or two to not feel like one anymore. But we're very fortunate here to have Georgia State so close to the Capitol, and to the Plummer Lecture Series, to be able to bring in folks from all over the country and to be able to listen to them. And you know, I'm joined here today, as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, close to the Capitol, with two of my colleagues, Commissioner Bubba McDonald and Commissioner Doug Everett, over at the Public Service Commission. This is an issue we naturally have a strong interest in. I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Santer in a second. Welcome him from California. And as I said before, I looked at some of his lectures that he's done. The Commission, we've been doing a lot of energy issues, and you know, humanity's influence on, or humanity's effect on global warming is something that I'm very interested in. I've got a very open mind about it, so I'm going to be interested to hear Dr. Santer, so please everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Santer.
We're going to have Dr. Crawford Elliott do a brief introduction, and before that, let me just, I do want to first acknowledge we are also honored, in addition to our Public Service Commissioners, and thank you all for being here, we have Gwen Keys Fleming, who is the Region 4 Director for EPA, and we're so honored by her presence. And with her is Brian Myers, who runs their climate change program. Did I get that correct?
My senior advisor.
Yes, Senior Advisor for Climate Change. So it's really wonderful that y'all were able to join us. I'm just going to say a very few remarks about John Sibley, who really does not need much of an introduction, because I think everyone in this room, with the exception of Dr. Santer, has worked with John Sibley over the years. He has been long engaged in the environmental issues and energy issues in particular in Atlanta. He is a rare breed. He's actually an Atlanta native, educated at Westminster and went to Wesleyan and then Yale Law School. He practiced law for about a dozen years before joining the Joe Frank Harris administration, and that began a long career in public policy on energy and environment. I first knew him when he was president of the Georgia Conservancy. He was there for almost 10 years. Then he sort of retired. Then he went to SEA, working on energy efficiency issues. He's now a senior public policy fellow at Southface. He will be doing a discussion with Dr. Santer, and before we bring John Sibley up, we'll have Dr. Crawford Elliott make some introductory remarks for Dr. Santer.
Thank you, Stephanie, very much. First off, on behalf of my colleagues in geosciences, we welcome everyone to this talk today, and I'm looking forward very much to this conversation that Ben will have with John. I think it's going to be very illuminating. The natural record is a very difficult record, and then when you add what humankind has done, this is indeed a very difficult record to try to decipher the impacts of humankind versus those that nature has put in there already. So then we go to Ben and his colleagues in particular to try to understand these things on a global scale. And it's indeed one of the most complex systems, full of data, large data, that you could ever imagine. And so I'm thrilled that Ben was able to say yes and join us for the Plummer Lecture. Just a few words about Ben, and then we'll, I think, go on to our conversation today. Ben is currently a distinguished scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he's been for about 20 years. He received all 3 of his degrees from the East Anglia University in the UK. And he's a scientist that challenges both his own preconceived notions as well as those in the literature. And so he's always questioning. He's a persistent questioner, he's a persistent learner, and he's a persistent investigator, which is perhaps one of the best things you can say about a scientist, I think. All along, he's published many papers in many journals. His CV is a mile long. He's also received many awards that are noteworthy. He received the MacArthur Genius Award in 1998. He was elected to fellowship of the American Geophysical Union not too long ago, and also at that time he was also elected to membership of the United States National Academy of Science. Most notably, he's the lead author of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report in 2007, which later received the Nobel Prize. So in that work, there were three immortal words: a discernible human influence, and those words were words that were heard around the world. And so I think it's best now just to turn the program over to Ben, to John, and say we're thrilled to have both of you today. Stephanie, thank you for organizing this program. To the sponsors, thank you for contributing to this great event. And Ben and John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
We don't have microphones, so we're just going to project. Can everybody hear all right in the back? If we kind of keep our voices up, all right, that ought to be fairly easy. Dr. Santer and I haven't had a lot of time to prepare here, but in the little conversation I had, I did come to understand that with a great audience like this, he just appreciates the opportunity to be able both to talk and share some of his thoughts, but also to hear your questions and concerns, so you don't get to sit back and assume that you get to spend the next 45 minutes listening to us in conversation. You need to stay alert and think of the things that you would like to know when you have the opportunity to be in conversation with somebody like this. I'm going to sort of tee it off, ask a few questions to get it started, but if I get too carried away with the conversation, Stephanie's going to let me know I'm running on too far, because we're going to want to turn it over to you to be in conversation for most of the time. But let me say that if I had the whole time, as I thought about the things you know that I'd like to know more about, I think if I had the time, I'd be wanting to hear a little more about where the science stands now. I think your particular experience has thrown you into a situation where you've had to learn a lot more about communicating the science than most scientists ever do. And most of us in this room struggle with how to communicate the science, and so I sure would like to ask you some questions about that if I could. And then I'd also want a little bit of time on what the future looks like. What's the science? What picture of the future is the science painting? Those would be things I'd be interested in, and until Stephanie tells me I've run on long enough, I'm going to try to sort of cue those areas for you, but others may have others. But let me start it here, because I know that one concern you've expressed or thought you've had is that our public dialogue on the issue tends to get hung up on just a couple of data sets, and that there's a much broader set of indicators out there that we need to pay attention to. So help us see that broader picture. You know, what is the broader set of indicators that you think are convincing that something's going on with the client that we need to pay attention to?
Well, thank you, John. Before I try and answer that question, I just want to say thanks to Pearl, to Crawford, and to Stephanie for giving me these two extraordinary opportunities, both yesterday during the Plummer lecture to speak to many of your students and faculty, and today at lunchtime. Opportunity is the right word here. I believe strongly that my job is not just to do the best possible research I can to improve our understanding of the nature and causes of climate change, but I receive federal funding, and I have to be accountable to the public. I have to stand up there in the public arena and let people know, hopefully in plain English, what we've learned and why they should care about it. So having these twin opportunities to do just that, I'm very thankful for them.
Pardon me, sir. Can you raise your voice just a little? It's probably more my problem than yours.
Sure.
Yeah. speak just a little.
And that microphone is for the
No.
video. It doesn't project, unfortunately.
I would be happy to, sir. As I'll try and explain to you, I spend a lot of my time looking at signal-to-noise problems, so I'll try and make sure there's a signal that emerges from the noise here. Is that better?
Yes, sir.
So, to answer your question, John, I think one story that hasn't been told in the last couple of years is this richness of the evidence, that there's not simply one observational data set out there, as some have argued, that gives us all of our understanding of observed climate change or of human effects on climate. Some folks in the last couple of years have tried to make just that argument, that surface thermometer records tell us really everything about the reality of warming of the Earth's surface, and if you take those surface thermometer records away, we have nothing. We have no understanding of changes in our planet's climate. That's not true. So as scientists, we look at many, many different lines of evidence. We have surface thermometer records. We have measurements of ocean heat content that go back 50, 60 years. We have measurements of the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. We use satellites to measure the temperature not only at the surface of the Earth, but also right up into the stratosphere, 20, 25, 30 miles above the Earth's surface. We look at clouds using satellites, changes in cloud cover, changes in cloud properties. We look at changes in circulation patterns. And all of this information, this rich information, contributes to our understanding of observed climate change. Another point to make is that our understanding of changes in the climate system doesn't just rely on computer models. Some people seem to think, oh, well, you scientists only use these complex numerical models to study change. Again, it's primarily the story in the observations, the story in temperature, in ice, in snow, in winds, in clouds, that gives me as a scientist conviction that there's something really going on there, that there is some signal that's beginning to emerge from the noise. I would also like to point out that it's never been an either-or proposition. All human influence, all natural influence on climate. The reality is that the climate system is like a symphony. If you listen to a symphony, there are many different sections contributing to the overall sound that you hear. The woodwinds, the brass, percussion, and it's difficult to figure out the relative contributions of each of those sections to what you hear. In the same way in the climate system, there are purely natural changes in climate, year to year, decade to decade changes associated with things like El Niños and La Niñas. There are changes in the sun's energy output. There are changes in the amount of volcanic dust in the atmosphere, all purely natural. But in addition to those, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that by burning fossil fuels, we've changed the chemical composition of the Earth's atmosphere. That's a mutable fact. That's not a belief system. That's not speculation. We know we've changed the surface of the land by cutting down forests, and those large-scale changes in the properties of the land surface have implications for the amount of sunlight that's reflected back into space, for the transport of moisture from the soil into the atmosphere. Not natural. So the real scientific challenge in my field has always been to figure out how much. How large is that human imprint on climate relative to the purely natural causes? And the best information we have, not only from our research at Livermore, but from many, many groups around the world, is that the signal has emerged from the noise, and that humans are no longer just innocent bystanders in the climate system. We're now active participants in the climate system.
So, where in recent times, where have been the most significant advances in the science that help make that picture clearer?
I would say satellites. So since the late 1970s, we've had the ability to observe the climate of planet Earth from space. Transformation. You know, imagine here we are going through time, measuring temperature at individual locations on the Earth's surface, sending ships across the ocean, making measurements along ship tracks, but we can't really see the entire planet, the entire planetary atmosphere, ice cover. We can't look at the massive ice sheets like the Greenland ice sheet and try and figure out, is it growing or is it shrinking? And if it's shrinking, how much is it contributing to sea level rise? So since the late 1970s, with our ability to put up a variety of different satellites, a variety of different sensors, and make these measurements of snow, of temperature, of clouds, we can look at true global scale changes in our planet's climate. That was a sort of real paradigm shift, that ability to go from local monitoring to truly global monitoring. And to me, it's those global measurements from satellites that tell us, hey, Arctic sea ice is on the way out. In the lifetime of our children and grandchildren, it's entirely likely that there will be an ice-free Arctic in summertime. And that's a different world. We know from these measurements that the Greenland ice sheet is losing mass and contributing to global mean sea level rise. That will be something that our descendants have to deal with. A profoundly different world, a warmer world, a world in which sea level is higher, a world with less snow, with less sea ice. My opinion is that we need to understand the climatic shape of things to come, the things that are in the pipeline that we're going to have to deal with, and our kids are going to have to deal with. And the more information we have about those changes, their rapidity, their size, their granularity, their seasonal and regional distributions, the better choices we will be able to make about how to deal with those changes.
Let me drill a little further, because my understanding, and I'm not deep in the science, but my understanding is just over the swings of ice ages coming and going, that there have been times when the planet is heated up even as it is now. So what is it in all of that that convinces you that what's going on now can't be explained by natural causes?
Sure, that's a great question, and I have to deal with that one in almost every presentation. Do natural cycles, things like ice ages, mean that everything we've experienced over the last century and a half is purely natural? And the answer to that question is no. We understand a lot about the drivers of ice ages. We know that three things are largely the drivers of ice ages: the tilt of the Earth's axis, the gyroscopic wobble of the Earth's axis, and how eccentric the Earth's orbit is around the sun. And those three things vary on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And they control the amount of sunlight and the distribution of sunlight with season and latitude that we receive on the Earth's surface. So at some times in these cycles of tilt of the axis and eccentricity of the orbit, we build up ice sheets, as we did in the last ice age. And the world is profoundly different. Other times we receive more solar radiation at the Earth's surface, and we melt those ice sheets. We understand those ice age cycles very, very well. But the key thing is they operate on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. What's happening over the last 150 years has nothing to do with that slow ice age waltz. It's a fast dance. It's a tango. And the leading partner in that dance is carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Gases that we have produced by burning fossil fuels. Again, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt by looking at isotopes of carbon that most of the roughly 30% increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution is us. That's due to human-caused burning of fossil fuels. We have changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And the reasonable scientific question has always been, okay, we've changed levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. How much climate change are we responsible for relative to these natural effects? And that is the signal to noise problem. That is the question of trying to quantify the noise associated with changes in the sun and volcanoes and El Niños and La Niñas, and we'll never have perfect understanding. But the best understanding that we have after many decades of research is that the human contribution over the last 150 years is larger than the purely natural contribution. What we see in the climate system, in temperature, in ice, in snow, in many, many different aspects, can't be explained by natural causation alone.
I'll hit you, I hope not cold with this one, but those of us who follow this a little bit, just in the last couple of days have been reading about a new report, which I think is in Science magazine, if I remember correctly, which, as I understand it, says that is along those same lines and says that what is different or what is notable in this study is that the rate of acceleration of change in temperature over the last 50 years is one thing you can't account for any other way. But so I was wondering how that study fits into that context you were talking about.
Right. Well, that's a paper that appeared in Science within the last couple of weeks by some folks at Oregon State University. And what they try and do is what a number of other researchers have tried to do, to look at these indirect recorders of temperature, to look at things like tree rings and ice cores and sediment records, things that do not directly measure temperature but are responsive to temperature. And by interrogating these indirect recorders, you can try and put together some picture of how climate has changed over thousands of years. And that information tells us that the present is unusual in the context of deep time, in the context of, at least the last 18,000 years. The rapidity of these temperature changes that we're seeing is highly unusual in the context of our best understanding of deep time. And that's entirely consistent, that finding, with these rapid changes that we're making in levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Right. Stephanie's telling me that I'm hogging the time here, but I got one more question I got to ask. And I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit. And I don't know your family situation, but I'm going to assume you've got a 10-year-old daughter. Excuse me, a 10-year-old granddaughter. That's just an assumption. And that she comes home and says to you one day, Grandpa, we were talking about climate science in science class today, talking about the climate, and I know you work on that, and I'm a little worried, but can you tell me what the world is going to look like when I get old? And what do you say to your 10-year-old granddaughter? And I choose 10 years because that's about my level of understanding. What do you say to your 10-year-old granddaughter about what the world may look like as she grows old?
Well, I don't have that 10-year-old granddaughter. I do have a 20-year-old son, and I have spoken in a number of his junior high and high school classes. He was always embarrassed to have Dad come into school. He thought that would hamper his chances of finding a girlfriend. His dad, scientist, came into school and talked to the other kids. If I did have the 10-year-old granddaughter, I would tell her that our best understanding, our best shot is that the climate you will experience will be very different from the climate I experienced. I grew up in, I lived in. Truth in advertising. I'm not only a climate scientist, I'm also a climber. I've spent a lot of my life since I was 18 in the Alps, in the Himalayas, in the Rockies, all around the world. I love climbing. I love these fragile, high alpine environments. And over one human lifetime, I've seen these things change. Many of the glaciers that I climbed on in the Alps are almost gone. My 10-year-old granddaughter will experience these kind of places in a fundamentally different way than the way I experienced them. And to me, that's profoundly sad. Final answer to your question, you know, in the primaries and in the last presidential debate, there's been tremendous discussion of fiscal debt and the unfairness of burdening my hypothetical 10-year-old granddaughter and our other kids and grandkids with debt that they did not create. Now, you could take out those words, fiscal debt, and substitute environmental debt without any loss of meaning. It seems to me that if we're seriously concerned, as we should be, about fiscal debt and saddling future generations with debt they did not create, we ought to be equally serious and concerned about saddling them with environmental debt that is equally real and that they did not create and contribute to. If we are forced to tell them, it's your problem, we haven't been able to do anything to understand it, I'm really sorry, you gotta deal with it now, well, that would be very disappointing to me.
All right, we're opening it to the floor for conversation. Jay, I think your hand went up first.
Climate change is quite different from some of the traditional environmental issues we're used to dealing with. And I'm not sure the scientific community has communicated with the public on the distinction between emissions of greenhouse gases and accumulations of greenhouse gases. Could you talk a little bit about the current understanding of science of how long carbon dioxide and other gases remain in the atmosphere and what the implications of that are for the climate?
Sure, great question. Did everybody get that? So the question relates to the long lifetime of some of these greenhouse gases. So some of the carbon dioxide that we emit in the process of burning fossil fuels remains in the atmosphere for decades to centuries. That's a very different situation from particulates, which we also produce by combustion processes. Soot, for example. You stop burning, the stuff rains out of the atmosphere within a couple of weeks. It's gone. Carbon dioxide, even if we had some magic wand and we could wave it over the atmosphere and say, we are going to freeze current levels of greenhouse gases as they are now on March the 13th, 2013, the planet would continue to warm. And that's because the atmosphere and the ocean take time, particularly the ocean, to equilibrate to the levels of greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere. So that's the size of the problem there, that even if we could do the unthinkable and stop all emissions of greenhouse gases today, the planet will continue to warm, sea level will continue to rise. So ultimately, it seems to me, we have to figure out how to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and probably even how to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, how to draw it down and lock it up. If we can't do those things, then the hypothetical 10-year-old granddaughter will experience a very, very different climate normal than we've all experienced in this room.
Commissioner.
I was just curious, when you're doing your analysis, is there any one culprit that just jumps out at you? Is it electric plants or manufacturing or transportation or loss of trees? Is there any one that just jumps way out above everything else?
Well, remember I mentioned that there's been about a 30% increase in atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. Our best understanding is that 2-3 centuries ago, levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were about 260, 270 parts per million. Now, just within the last couple of weeks, we're at 400 parts per million. And again, by looking at carbon isotopes, our best understanding is that we're responsible for about 75 to 80% of that increase by burning fossil fuels. The other 25 to 20% is probably due to agricultural practices, cutting down forests, releasing carbon to the atmosphere that way. So in terms of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, most of that is due to fossil fuel burning. And again, that's something we know pretty well from these carbon isotope measurements made around the world by many, many different groups.
Does that answer it, or you want to take it?
Well, I guess I was looking even narrowing it down. Is it fossil fuel? I mean, is it transportation? Is it manufacturing? Is it energy production? Or I just wondering if there was one that just really jumped out at you. Maybe it's just a pretty even combination. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not the best person in the room to answer that question. I'm sure there are folks in the room who could give you a much better answer. My sense is that it's mostly power generation in the United States, at least if we're focusing solely on the United States. Transportation has a big role to play as well. I'm sure others in the room, maybe someone wants to chime in, could give you a better breakdown today of the relative contributions of power generation versus transportation to U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases.
All right.
Do you want to add?
I could probably answer that question
okay,
quick.
yeah.
Because right now we have a greenhouse gas reporting rule that's been put into place for the last 2 years, or at least 3 years, and we've got 2 years of data now to show where the greenhouse gases are coming from, and the majority come from energy, industrial, and transportation. It depends on the state. For example, energy production in Louisiana is pretty high, so most of theirs is coming from energy, whereas in Florida, you have a lot more transportation, miles driven. A lot of their greenhouse gases come from burning of transportation. So, here in Georgia, I think it's pretty about even, about all three.
Yes, sir. I think you were.
Yesterday during your presentation, I was a little disappointed you didn't show any polar bears drowning or anything else like that. You didn't present some of the bad effects that a lot of other people talk about. But one of the things I would like to ask you about is the warming of the Arctic, and the permafrost is going away, and I understand that methane is now being released in those areas. And also you mentioned about the acidification of the oceans, and that the calcium carbonate that has been sequestered there as seashells or as coral reefs or whatever are now being dissolved by the higher acid in the water, and that's releasing carbon also.
Okay, let me respond briefly to those points. It's clear that many folks out there who study the effects of climate change on ecosystems think there's a signal there too of changing climate on the distribution, the abundances of different plant and animal species. Lots of people could speak very authoritatively to those issues, and it's a real concern. We know that as we're changing the climate, that has implications not only for us, but for ecosystems as well. With regard to permafrost and methane release from thawing permafrost, you're absolutely right. That's not some future hypothetical. That's happening now. Companies that operate in the Arctic that have relied for many years on having permafrost and building roads on permafrost now have to get to grips with impermafrost and doing their operations in a different environment where permafrost is thawing, it's releasing methane to the atmosphere, another powerful greenhouse gas. Another concern is that as we warm the oceans, some of this methane is locked up in semi-solid form and seems to be, at least in some areas, destabilizing and releasing methane to the atmosphere. Again, these aren't hypotheticals. People go out and make these measurements in the Arctic. There's famous YouTube video of one researcher outgassing methane from a thawing pool in the permafrost. People have published papers in Siberia recently looking at these plumes of methane that are being released from the ocean floor. So this is real, this is happening, and we don't have a good handle on the rate of release of methane and how much will be released. But there's a lot of concern about that and a lot of research being done to try and understand the consequences of very rapid release of large amounts of methane to the atmosphere.
And then also,
acidification.
Like you said, even if we eliminated carbon dioxide right now, it would continue, and then these other things would continue.
Yeah. Again, that's why this problem is so wicked, as people have referred to it, that even if we could do what we currently don't have the technological capability to do and freeze atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases as they are now, March 13, 2013, there would be continued warming, continued rise in sea level until the climate system hundreds of years later equilibrates to the levels of greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere. That equilibration process is really, really slow. It's like when you put your foot on the accelerator of your car, you don't instantaneously reach the final speed you've committed yourself to by depressing the accelerator a certain way. It takes time to reach that final speed because of the inertia and the mass of the car. In the same way, the climate system has a lot of thermal inertia because of the large heat capacity of the oceans. And just finally, acidification is real. Again, that's not some future hypothetical. The oceans are getting more acidic as they're drawing down atmospheric CO2. We've measured changes in ocean pH, in ocean acidity, at many stations around the world, and there's a lot of concern about the implications of those changes in ocean chemistry for the integrity of marine organisms that have calcareous shells. So again, another present-day concern, something that Congress, I think, held hearings about in the last couple of years, not a future hypothetical.
Back to John's point earlier, I just heard a recent poll that said that 13%, I try not to follow polls as much, but 13% of Americans polled said they closely follow science. And to the point he was making about the 10-year-old granddaughter, where do you see the industry from a generational shift in our students coming out of college going into careers that are focusing on climate science, or do you see a regression in the amount of students that are going into these careers to continue the work that is dealing with climate change?
Well, great question. I'm always tremendously humbled when I get out of my little office and come to a place like Georgia State University. And I see firsthand, up close and personal, how people like Crawford and others in the room, Pearl, are educating the next generation of students and trying to give them some sense of the science, uncertainties in the science, why they need to care about it. Ultimately, that's how you get a more informed electorate, and that's how we collectively take better decisions on the what to do about it. If people are scientifically savvy, if they have some understanding of what the likely outcomes might be, what's really at stake here. So the work that is done here at Georgia State and in other institutions around the country to give people the tools that they need, computer science, math, statistics, atmospheric sciences, meteorology, social sciences too, understanding decision-making in the real world and how those decisions in the real world about energy usage and mix of energies translate into changes in atmospheric chemistry, changes in climate. I can publish a scientific paper, maybe 100 people in the world read it. You have a class here in geosciences, hundreds of students attend. Those hundreds of students go out into the world and they influence hundreds of others. Maybe some of them wind up being congressional aides or congressmen or congresswomen and have influence, have the ability to make decisions for all of us. So that's what really will shift the needle, that public education, giving people the scientific tools they need to understand these complex issues and make smart decisions about them.
I seem to be getting people up front, so who's in the back? Let's do the way back.
Thank you. I have a kind of a historical question about the debate, if you will, about global warming over the last 50 years. And I take you back to, I was a undergraduate, graduate student in physics many years ago. Of course, it was a trivial science that global warming was going to be caused by CO2, so there's no question about it. And the basic science of that and the way CO2 permits black body radiation from the sun to go through it without any resistance, if you will, and it reflects infrared radiation from the Earth, is trivial. And I've always been intrigued by how money has shifted the debate, because they could fight on the empirical side and measurement proof retrospectively. You can always use your ceteris paribus and other debates to make that a complicated issue. Why hasn't the science community articulated the fundamental science of how CO2 inevitably, necessarily causes global warming? It's part of the story. I understand how you got to debate how much, but we can do very good predictions a priori of how much CO2, we know how much we put in there, how much coal would burn, and so on. We can calculate pretty well how much we should expect that to affect the thermal absorption in the Earth. How come that's not in the debate or Al Gore's movie and so on? But it's such a, I mean, that's just 1 and 1 is 2 science. That's not the complexity of empirical measurement and prediction. Enough money can turn that into debate, you know, endlessly. Yes, they do. And I'm just curious why that's not part of the story from the science community.
Well, good question, and perhaps we haven't been as good as we need to be in articulating that basic physics, that understanding of what's going to happen as you increase levels of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In particular, you know, we haven't been that good in articulating the fact that our understanding of the reality of a discernible human influence on climate doesn't rest on models alone. You know, it derives from basic physics. It derives from many different kinds of observations made independently by hundreds of groups around the world with different instruments. That's to me part of the story that has not been conveyed very well. And I take your point. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career looking at water vapor in the atmosphere. And we know, based on very simple physics, moist thermodynamics, that when you increase the temperature of the ocean surface or the lowermost layer of the atmosphere by about 1 degree Celsius, you get about a 6% increase in the amount of moisture in the atmosphere. And that's exactly what we see in the satellite measurements of water vapor increase. So the observations, the models, are really giving us information that fits with basic physics, with basic theory, and I don't think we've been particularly good in telling that story. you know, one of the problems has been in science, there's not a lot of incentive for communication. People who engage in science communication are often viewed with some skepticism. Oh, you know, that fellow, that lady there, they're just doing this to draw attention to themselves, to be in the limelight. There's almost a penalty associated with that in science. Now that's changing. In the last couple of years, professional societies have recognized that it's really imperative to do a better job training scientists not only to be excellent researchers, but also to tell people in plain English.
It's probably worse in the U.S., isn't it, around the...
It's changing. You know, organizations like the National Science Foundation are now putting aside money in research grants for communication. They're saying it's not good enough just to do the research. You've also got to be able to tell people in plain English what you learned and why it matters to them. And that's very, very promising to me, that some of the stigma associated with climate science communication is being removed. Speaking personally, you know, I recognize back when the discernible human influence statement came out in 1996, I spent 1.5 years of my scientific career defending that statement, being investigated by Congress, all kinds of nasty things. You know, people claimed that I was going to be indicted by the Hague International Court of Justice and be, you know, at the same time as Slobodan Milosevic was being tried for crimes against humanity. So this was all kind of difficult for a junior climate scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And what I learned from that experience was that I could not just go back to my office and close the door and hope that everything would go away. It wouldn't. And I had some responsibility. I was a representative. I was not just the lead author of one chapter of this 1995 report. I was a representative of my colleagues, my peers, and I had the responsibility to set the record straight, to tell people what had happened, how we arrived at that discernible human influence statement, and I could not shirk that responsibility.
2 questions. Okay, I'm going to go one left, Ashton, and you get one here, and then I'm going to come one back over here in a minute.
A lot of your responses have dealt with the recovery of the planet, of the CO2 emissions. But in a lot of the discussion, there's a term tipping point where the planet won't recover. Do you have any sense where we are in reaching that point and when it might happen?
Wow. Well, great question. I always like this one saying from Wally Broker, a climate scientist at Lamont Doherty in New York, someone who has spent much of his life studying paleoclimate. And he said, climate is like an angry beast, and we're poking it with a sharp stick. And his point was that based on his study of the past, of deep time, that should not give us comfort. There are times in the past when there have been very rapid changes in climate, and we know that there are these tipping points in the climate system when you start melting a lot of sea ice and changing the salinity in the North Atlantic. That's a place that drives some of these circulations that really are responsible for transporting a lot of heat in the ocean. You have the possibility, when you make very rapid changes in small areas in the salinity and density structure of the ocean, of having sudden switches to a different state of ocean circulation. We don't know how close we are to such tipping points, but we do know, based on study of deep time, that they exist. So that's the real challenge, you know, figuring out, in Wally Broker language, how close are we, you know, to poking the angry beast and getting it really mad and having some very rapid changes. I wish I could give you a good answer to that. I can't.
One more. I'm going to go further back over here.
Sure. Thanks for your excellent talk. This has really been interesting. Stephanie, thanks for the invitation. Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, recently published an article in Rolling Stone called Climate Warming's Terrifying New Math. It created quite an impact at Athens, I believe, Atlanta, around the country. He alleges that we're losing the climate war, we're losing it badly and quickly if we continue to rely on fossil fuels, even just the known reserves that are in the ground. We're, hell-bent on destroying the ecology of the planet. We asked some Georgia faculty to review this for us. Tish Yeager at UGA said this is the first time I've ever been asked to peer review a Rolling Stone article. But then I guess it was a quick take on it. I'm doing the same with you, but from the point of view of McKibben's science, and what he calls doing the math, is how you feel about how bad things really are, according to McKibben.
I am not familiar with his Rolling Stones article. I've heard about it, but I have not read it, so I don't think I can give you a really informed response. What I can say is that I'm actually optimistic. People often ask me, how the heck can you go to work in the morning? Why aren't you profoundly depressed by everything that you know and you understand? And my sense of optimism comes because in parallel with the signal that I see in the physical climate system, this warming signal, this moistening of the atmosphere, I see some signal in public understanding. I really do think that the debate has moved from, is the planet warming, to, okay, it is warming, there is some human culpability, we don't quite understand how large the human effect is, but it's not trivially small, and ultimately, regardless of what our convictions are, political, religious, ideological, we're going to have to grapple with this problem. So that to me is very, very encouraging, that smart people from many different walks of life, many different backgrounds, care about their kids and grandkids. Those are our investment in the future. And I think all of us share that common concern about protecting that particular investment in the future and making sure that they grow up in a world that does not have destabilizing climate change, in a world where they can still go to coral reefs and see beautiful creatures, where they can do what I did when I was young, go to these fragile, high alpine environments and still walk on a glacier. Many people, I think, get that and understand that and share that. And that gives me a lot of optimism about our future. I think that people, when confronted by the science, when given the right information, are capable of making smart decisions on what to do about it.
Stephanie, would you like to close? Or?
No, well, I think that's the perfect note to end on, optimism and hope. And I just want to say thank you to John Sibley and Dr. Ben Santer for this fabulous discussion.
I'll just say one more word. On the Georgia State Plumber Lecture website, you can listen to a fabulous interview that Dr. Santer gave in January, where he puts a lot of this into language that can be well communicated. And also we'll have some aspects of his lecture from yesterday, the slides that he used to demonstrate the science that he is informing us of. So you can go to that website and find more pieces of that. And Stephanie, what's your plan for what's videotaped here?
We're going to put it up on the GreenLaw website.
Excellent. So there'll be lots of other resources for that great communication. So thank you again, Stephanie, so much for this opportunity. John, thank you. And of course, Ben, thank you.